Now, 1947 is the year that India was partitioned into two states. Pakistan, which consisted of West and East Pakistan, and India itself. The 1947 migration is one of the largest and most rapid migration that has ever taken place. In a span of only 4 years, more than 14.5 million people were moved. One of the largest themes that we see during the partition is of religious strife, because the partition was, after all, done on religious lines. As an aftermath, the demographics of entire provinces and districts were drastically changed. And up until recently, we've never had a clear picture of how much the change has been. But that's exactly what we're going to talk about in this video. Hi, my name is Misha and welcome to Tarihi Tales. Now, I found a research study which was published by the Harvard Kennedy School, and a lot of renowned economists and historians, some of whom are also South Asian, have worked on this study, and they've really done a very rigorous job of kind of studying these patterns. Now, in part one, we've actually talked about the different changes in the larger demographics of all three countries, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. But in this video, we're going to be talking about the number of deaths that happened on each border, the number of deaths that happened along religious lines. And in order to do that, we also have some historical data that kind of validates the numbers that the researchers reached at. Now, Lawrence James notes, Sir Francis Moody, the governor of West Punjab, estimated that 500,000 Muslims died trying to enter his province, while the British High Commissioner in Karachi put the full total at 800,000. This makes nonsense of the claim by Mountbatten and his partisans that only 200,000 were killed. But the researchers basically reached to the number 1.26 million. But this quote that I talked about is talking about the western border between Pakistan and India, right? Some of the British officers are kind of estimating that almost close to 1 million people died while trying to enter the Pakistani side of Punjab from the Indian side. And the researchers, because of their methodology, reached to the number 1.26 million, which is quite close to what the Britishers were quoting at that time. So it means that 1.26 million Muslims went missing on the border between India and Pakistan. And that means they basically left India for Pakistan but never made it. They were killed along the way. And similarly, 0.84 million Hindus and Sikhs also left the Pakistani side of the border and went towards India but never reached there. They were killed. So on the Punjab border alone, almost 2.2 million people had died. Now, when you look at the other border, the eastern border, which was then East Pakistan and India and is now Bangladesh and India, their estimates are that 1.1 million Muslims left India to enter Bangladesh but never made it and were killed. On the other side, 0.24 million Hindus and Sikhs left Bangladesh and tried to enter India but never made it. So on the eastern border, we see that 1.34 million people ended up dying. Now, there are some other studies that kind of talk about the deaths on the Bengal border, which were much, much higher. So where these researchers kind of got to the number 1.34 million, those studies actually show numbers as high as 9 million. That's a huge difference. So here's where the methodology part of the research kind of becomes important. In the methodology that the other study uses, which estimates 9 million deaths, their methodology is not able to distinguish between deaths from partition and deaths from the Bengal famine. So that is why their numbers are so much higher, because the number of people that died along the Bengal border also included people who died of the famine in that study. But in this study, they're able to kind of rule out those deaths and kind of only isolate the number of people that went missing because of partition. So that's the importance of methodology, because that's how drastically things can change. And that's why we should always know the methodology of any of the studies that we're looking into. So some of the final findings of the study are basically as follows. When they talk about inflows, they say that, well, firstly, the separation of more than 2,000 miles between both parts of Pakistan, the east and the west. This kind of made two centers of partition within India itself, and states like Punjab and Bengal were more affected than other states. Second, the western and the eastern borders experienced very, very different dynamics of partition. Till 1951, the inflows on the western border which is now Pakistan, were 3 times higher than the inflows on the border with Bangladesh. Thirdly, they talk about that, initially we mentioned that they're looking at district levels, right? And that's how they're comparing both the countries. They see that within the same state, when they move from one district to the next, there's a huge difference in the number of outflow and inflow of people. Now, a very good example of this is in Indian Punjab. The district of Amritsar received about 332,000 people, while the district of Gurgaon, which is close by, received only 84,000 people. So there's a huge difference on what the patterns kind of look like on the district level, even though they're quite close by. In Pakistani Punjab, we see that the city of Lalpur, which is now called Faisalabad, received more than 1 million migrants, but the city of Rawalpindi received only about 106,000. So again, a huge gap in areas that are relatively closer to each other. Now, when we talk about outflows, the researchers noticed that people moved out from the same places that received the most inflows, Punjab and Bengal. The rest of the states saw relatively lower outflows than these two. And now even within the states that had large outflows, when we come down to the district level, again, there's a huge difference in the kind of patterns that we're seeing. Now again, looking at the Indian side of Punjab, some districts, we only see an outflow of 17,000 people. But when we look at the district of Amritsar that we talked about earlier, we see that almost 900,000 people had moved out of Amritsar, which is a big number. In Bangladesh, Bogra saw an outflow of 33,500 people, while when you look at Dhaka, we see that 560,000 people moved in. Now, when migrants moved into each of these new countries, how did they decide where to settle, right? Now, the first factor that the researchers found was distance, that people migrated from closer to the border and settled in places that were closer to the border. Secondly, we also see that people migrated into places where other people had migrated out of. So we basically see like a replacement effect. This close relationship between people moving out and people moving into the same areas kind of shows that maybe the houses of the evacuees were kind of being reallocated to people who were moving in. We see that in Punjab, in Indian Punjab, and also in Pakistan, this kind of formula was applied and people were being facilitated in migrating, and they were being allotted houses of the people that had evacuated. But in Bangladesh, the case is quite different. They were actually actively trying to prevent such an exchange. Now, the third factor that affected where migrants would be living was larger cities. So districts with larger cities would generally see a larger inflow of people. And now the researchers found that in the case of India, 0.5% more migration took place in districts with larger cities. They were unable to find such statistics in the case of Pakistan, West or East, because both of those areas had very few large cities. So they weren't able to kind of statistically make a number out of it. But when you do like a qualitative study and you look at the numbers of people in the different cities, for example in Karachi, we see that this theory holds true because the majority of the migrants that moved into the Sindh province settled into the city of Karachi rather than the surrounding areas. Now, all of this migration again had a huge effect on the demographics of each of these areas. In Indian Punjab, the number of Muslims in 1931 was 3.5 million, and by 1951, this number had been reduced to only 0.2 million. In terms of percentage of the population, in 1931, Muslims were like 30% of the population, and by 1951, they were only 1.8%. In Pakistani Punjab, the numbers are even more drastic. The percentage of Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistani Punjab in 1931 was almost 22%. And after the partition in 1951, their numbers had dropped down to 0.16%, which again is a huge drop. Now, even again, because they were looking at district level rather than state levels, the numbers are staggering. For example, again in the case of Amritsar, in 1931, more than 500,000 Muslims lived in Amritsar, and in 1951, only 4,000 Muslims remained. The Gujarat district in Pakistani Punjab had more than 130,000 Hindus and Sikhs, but after the partition in 1951, only 100 remained. So we see the huge demographic change that happened in all the levels of both of the countries because of this massive migration. In the case of Bangladesh, the numbers are not this staggering, even though there is a decline. We see that in 1931, 30% of the population is Hindus and Sikhs, but in 1951, only 22% of the population remains to be Hindus or Sikhs, which is still a huge decline. But when you look at the numbers for India and Pakistan, that looks so much better. And on the Indian side of Bengal, we see the same kind of numbers. Muslims accounted for about 30% of the population in 1931, and by the time it was 1951, they were down to 19%. So again, on the eastern border, the effect of the migration was a little bit more muted than on the western border, where it was drastic. So this research kind of points that even though while on the western border it looks like the reasons to migrate were definitely more religious oriented, because we see a decline and increase in the different religious minorities in both areas. But on the eastern border between Bangladesh and India, a different kind of scenario is emerging. So we can't really say that all of the migration on that border was on religious grounds. There were other factors that were maybe coming into play, which they're not able to kind of uncover with this study, but they're able to understand that something else is going on. We really need to see how was it that the study was conducted, because that kind of tells us that how legit it is, what are the limitations of it, where are they assuming stuff, and that's very important when looking at the result, because then we know that, well, everything is not set in stone. There were some assumptions and some, calculations that were made and all that. Here is the methodology of the study. Now, because they needed to find data sets about the population, right? They needed the sets before and after the partition. So what they ended up doing was that they used the 1931 census of British India, and then they used the 1951 census of both Pakistan and India. They purposefully avoided the 1941 census because that census has been a little bit controversial, and a lot of people talk about the fact that it's kind of unreliable. So they avoided that census and went straight to the 1951 one. Now they had the population data, right, with the census, but what they're looking for is the migration flow. So in order to do that, they need to kind of specify geographical units. For example, I can't compare how many people left, say, the city of Islamabad in Pakistan and moved somewhere, because at that time, Islamabad did not exist, right? So they needed some kind of geographical unit that would make sense. So the smallest possible unit that was making sense was the district level data. And even in that, the district level data had some issues, because in the 1931 census, the districts in British India were actually quite different from the ones that you would find in the 1951 census of both India and Pakistan, because a lot of the districts were changed. Some of them were entirely new. And even if a district had the same name, in a lot of the cases, the boundaries of the districts were now changed. So these researchers developed a very complex methodology where they kind of mapped these districts onto each other, and they made sure that they're comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges and not some other way around. And that gets a little bit tricky. So if you're interested in the immense detail of the methodology, then I will be linking this paper down below in the description box. You can go and have a look and you can read it yourself. Okay. Now these guys look at inflows, which is the number of people who migrated into a district due to partition. And these numbers are actually obtained directly from the census of 1951, because both the Indian and the Pakistani census asked the citizens that if they're migrants from the partition. So this one was quite easy for them to figure out. The Indian census used the term displaced persons for the migrants, and the Pakistani census used the term muhajirs. Now, so because they have this very direct question in the census, then we know for a fact that if there are new people into a district and they're saying that yes, they're a muhajir or they're a displaced person, then that means that they moved because of the partition. They're not internal migrants. Like, it's not like somebody moved from Lahore to Islamabad. They moved from India to Lahore or something like that. The other thing they look at is outflows, which is the number of people who left a district because of partition. Now, Unlike the inflows, the outflows were not that straightforward to measure. There was no question in the census saying that, do you know how many people moved out of here? No. So the researchers actually made another methodology to figure out the outflows. And in this, they assumed that anybody who migrated because of the partition migrated on religious grounds. That basically meant that anybody who migrated from West Pakistan or East Pakistan into India were either Hindus or Sikhs. Anybody who migrated from India into East Pakistan or West Pakistan were Muslims. So, using this assumption, they kind of made a formula figuring out, this is where the economist part of the researchers comes in, to figure out how many people would have been in India and Pakistan from within these minorities had the partition not taken place. They assumed that the rate of growth for the minorities would be the same as the rate of growth for the other populations. They subtracted the actual number of minorities from the projected number, and that gave them the outflows. That means that how many people actually left. Again, if you're interested in all the nitty-gritties, you can go down to the description box and go on over to the actual research study. Now, that was the methodology that they had used. So there we go. That was the India-Pakistan partition in very solid numbers. And as heartbreaking as it is, I feel like this research gives us a really good idea of the magnitude of the change, of the sudden change between all of these areas. And I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you liked it and if you want to see more videos like this, or if you have any other ideas, feel free to tell me down in the comments below. I will see you guys next time.